to day 3 of our Bridge to Success conference. If you're here, go ahead, throw your name in the chat. Tell us where you're joining from. We got a lot to cover this morning, but I'm super excited to introduce you to Dan Smith, who's actually a former colleague of mine. So I've asked him if he'd like to come speak and share some of his insights. He's been a mentor of sorts to me and has some really amazing things to share with you, and just a great way to inspire all of you. Make sure you're throwing your questions not in the chat, put it in the Q&A, but Dan's got a really awesome presentation put together for you today. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our headliner here, Dan. Take it away.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I am super excited about this because it's really a huge part of my journey. I'm going to start sharing the screen. If I can make sure I got it showing. And we'll just get right into it. Is it working? I have let me fix my screen so I can see what's going on. Okay, recommit the slideshow. Okay, so when I was just trying to figure out how I was going to sort of introduce this session, I wanted to sort of introduce with my own story. So right at the onset of the pandemic, I had already been developing a sort of plan to get out of education, to transition out, and the pandemic was a huge catalyst for me. So I actually moved to Denver, and when I was teaching in New York City. And when I moved to Denver, I had moved there because a really great friend of mine who was also kind of a mentor for me, she had transitioned out years before. And I remember she told me, she gave me tons of advice, and a lot of it had to do with this very thing. She's like, Dan, one of the first things she said, Dan, you're a linguist. You know that you have to change the language based on the situation you're in. And so I took that and I kind of ran with it. So I wanted to start my journey with my original LinkedIn photo, I'll call it. This was a photo that I took in front of my classroom before this like blog post that one of my assistant principals asked me to take a picture for, or send her a picture for, to sort of highlight teachers. And then it was my week to be highlighted or something like that. And so I took this picture and then I was like, oh, this is a really great picture. I love comics. This shows my personality, but it still looks pretty professional. Yeah. And so when I told my mentor friend about this, she was like, Dan, you got to take down the picture with the comics. It makes you look like you just cater to kids. And if you want to get into the corporate world, you got to cater to adults. And she said it in a very friendly kind of way, not in a like, I'm your coach and I'm telling you what to do. She said it because we're friends, but I really took it to heart because it really made sense. And so I, of course, changed my profile picture to this more professional picture that was professionally shot. But then I wanted to change it back after I got a job, and because I realized like there's this transition or difference when you're in the corporate world, and so and it actually changed. It really did change how people recruited me or not. And I used that as a catalyst to change my entire LinkedIn so that it wasn't catered to, it wasn't always talking about kids or children or things like that, because that is a stigma. And we know that that's a stigma. And unfortunately, that's a stigma. And it doesn't mean that we have to change who we are. It's just, we have to change the social profile so that it fits the profile for what we're aiming for, particularly on LinkedIn. So that's my like mini story about that. I'm gonna sort of walk this through an activity, and because one of the big things on LinkedIn that it asks is your job title, and I kept thinking to myself, well, what is my job title? I don't know what I want to be. I was a teacher, but what am I going to transition into? What can I do? And so I actually went to a coding boot camp. I learned how to code. So in the last 20 years of my profession, my professional careers, these are some of the titles that I've held: educator, software developer, public speaker, project manager, product owner, web designer, instructional designer, linguist, singer, performer, cheerleading coach, trainer, mentor, published academic. All of these titles I have been paid for. Like, they're part of my professional career. I'm not one of those things. I am many of those things. And I'm a combination of those things. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because all of you are a combination of those things. All of you are a combination of those many titles that you've held. And if there's anything that's more true of teachers, it's that teachers hold so many more hats than many other people in this world, because you do so many more things than others. One of the first things, I said this to my mother. She was an educator for 40 years, and at the time had already retired. But I told her when I came into the corporate world, my first sort of real job after being a teacher was as an instructional designer. And my title actually was learning experience designer. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And I said, Mom, do you know that in this job, I do 1/10 of what I did as a teacher, and I get paid more. The stress is less. It's the most magical thing that's ever happened to me. And we talked about that. We talked about the fact that a teacher is all the things and none of the appreciation. And then I come into this new job and I'm doing one of the things and getting accolades of appreciation and real world experience. So it helped me reflect on the toxicity of where I was, to the sort of like joy and relief, but also fulfillment that I found when I transitioned out. And that's not to put anything on anyone's experiences as a teacher, whether positive or negative. But there is a reason why we transition, right? So latch onto that reason and move with it. But move with it in a positive light and not so much a negative light. Reflect on the toxicity so that you can find the fulfillment, and then leave the toxicity behind. So to start off, I'm just going to go through a little bit of education lingo, and I'm going to talk about the word code switching. As I said, I'm a linguist. My predominant sort of expertise lies in languages. I speak many languages. And one of the sort of major aspects of languages is what's called code switching. Code switching is when you change your language or change the way you speak based on the environment that you're in or the context or situation that you're in. And this is really the crux of what we're talking about today is how do you code switch for a corporate environment? As educators, actually, we are quite masters of code switching. Every day that students come into the classroom, you have to code switch into teacher speak. And I'm sure many of you know your persona as a teacher is very different from your persona when you're hanging out with your friends or when you're with your family, things of that nature. It's a very different situation. And it's a similar situation if you're talking to your boss, if you're talking to somebody you don't know, or you're at the grocery store. Like we all code switch, but teachers definitely have a stronger sense of it because of the experience of speaking to very young children or teenagers versus adults and things of that nature. So depending on who you've taught in the past, your code switching is pretty on par for what you can do here when it comes to corporate speak and transitioning into the corporate world. So I put down, this is absolutely not an exhaustive list, but I put a list here of some kind of terminology that happens in education lingo. I actually need to switch through. I'm going to open up. I apologize if people are speaking in the chat and I'm not responding because I'm trying to. I can't see the chat while I'm displaying, but I have a second display. And I'm gonna try and add.
You're all good, Dan. Here. You're all good.
Thanks. Sorry for the pause. I want to get into.
While you're in the pause, if you don't have scratch paper, you're going to definitely need scratch paper. Dan's got an activity for you. So definitely find a pen or a pencil and some paper because you're about to do some brainstorming. So take this pause and grab something to write with. and grab a paper.
Oh, there it is. Okay, this is going to work so much better. Okay, sorry about that delay. I am going to, oops. Okay, are we still, am I still sharing the window? Can everybody see the presentation? Oh yeah, I can see it there. Okay, great. This is so much better. Now I can actually see what I'm doing and also see a little bit there. Okay, so much better. Okay, so thank you. Let's resume. And in all honesty, I don't know what people's levels are, where you're at in terms of your journey of transitioning. Maybe there are several people here who have transitioned out, a long time ago, and you're here for whatever reason. By all means, please add to this list. But I'm going to kind of go through each of them a little bit individually. We're going to start with students. Maybe you've been given the advice that students are. That you shouldn't say students, you should say clients or something like that. We're going to talk about students in a whole slide of its own. So we're gonna pause. That's why I put a star by that one. We're gonna pause at students. I promise you, we're gonna get to it, and then we'll talk about some of these other words first, and then we'll get back to it. So let's talk about advisor. Advisor or counselor sometimes is used in education speak, depending on whether you're higher ed or grade school. Really, what if you've acted as an advisor, or if you were an advisor of any kind in the corporate world, we use the word consultant essentially. If we want to talk about advising, it's not so much advising, it's consulting, it's strategic planning, it's analysis, needs analysis kind of thing. So we're going to, when you're switching, if you did anything in an advisory position, consider those other sort of role or terminology switches. Talk about being a consultant, talk about being a strategic planner. Okay. When it comes to orientation, whatever it is that you're orientating to, if you have like an orientation day for new students that are coming in or things of that nature, that's called onboarding in the corporate world, right? So when a new employee comes on, you are onboarding them, and especially in the L&D world, you're going to find yourselves, possibly if you're an instructional designer or if you're involved in any kind of training situation in L&D, you are going to be doing onboarding stuff, maybe even developing the onboarding training for certain departments or things of that nature. So it's important to understand the difference. We have institution or school. Both of those, obviously, unless you're working in ed tech, there's probably you're not going to be talking about schools or institutions. You're going to be talking about the company as a whole, or you can use the word organization, right? And especially if you're talking about the schools or institutions that you worked at, use the word organization. It works just as fine. Works just as well. And again, think about code switching. If you are talking to an ed tech company, it's much more likely that you can speak to them about having worked in schools or institutions, because most of their clients are probably schools and institutions as well. Again, code switching comes into play here. So think about that sort of situation. We have supervise, which is essentially manage. Depending on the organization, you may have a supervisor, but most likely in corporate speak, it's a manager. Then we have student conduct. This is a really important word because many of you may have been deans or some sort of student conduct police, if you will, the person who took care of all the students' behavior. But also in a classroom, you have to manage student conduct. So this is a really important word to sort of take and pivot the lingo to say things like building trust, incorporating safety, building safety, shaping values. Values is a big word here. Developing standards. These are things that you can talk about when it comes to student conduct, because those are all ways of saying, especially if you're going to go into some sort of manager role or leadership role in the corporate world, you want to speak to your ability to your very strong ability, especially if you've got classroom management skills, to develop, common standards for a team, and common values and things of that nature. So it's a very important word there to learn how to sort of explain your own expertise in. When we talk about admissions, especially if it's like a private school or a magnet school or a university or higher education, that admissions does not exist. It's recruiting in the corporate world. You're recruiting people to be employed there, right? So you'll have recruiters, not admissions officers or things of that nature. We have committee. This is actually really important. I had an experience where I was working on a committee in my last company, but we did not call it a committee. It was a tiger team. And I remember the first time they called it a tiger team, I was like, what in the world is a tiger team? This tiger team is essentially, you have different departments that has a specialist maybe in each department that are all coming together into one team in order to work on a product or work on a particular project, or maybe even ideate or develop a plan for some new venture that the company's doing. So it's important to talk about committees. In education, we have committees where it's like, oh, we have someone from the English department and someone from the math department, and we're doing these cross-curricular things. So we're going to create a cross-curricular committee to talk about whatever. This is the similar situation, but in the corporate speak, they call them tiger teams. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, can I ask what a tiger team is? And luckily I already had the job, so I didn't have to be embarrassed that I didn't know what was happening. And it was really, it was an eye opener to me. So the word teach is it's what we do, right? We're teachers. And so that's something important to think about when it comes to teaching is, and especially when it comes to code switching, is consider the industry. Whatever it is, wherever you're going into, there's going to be different types of words that you're going to kind of like switch from teaching. So facilitating, even training, developing talent is it's like a big lingo word right now. We're not teaching our employees, we're developing our employees' talent. Sometimes they even use things like upskill and things of that nature. So those kinds of words are the words that you can use in discussing these things, especially if you didn't just teach, students, but you also maybe you led some PDs, some professional developments for other colleagues. You didn't teach them. You facilitated professional development opportunities and experiences and things of that nature. So learning outcomes, we talk about learning outcomes all the time, right? That's how you build your curriculum. Learning outcomes really is our goals and objectives for a company. It's especially if you're in kind of corporate training aspect of L&D, that's where you're getting to. We have these goals and these objectives for our staff, our employees, and this is how we're developing our learning outcomes. Now, if you're working in ed tech and things of that nature, where education is the predominant product or aspect of the company, learning outcomes is definitely a term that you can use. So don't throw away these terminologies. Just know that there are other terminologies to go along with them. So academic year does not exist in the corporate world. It's either the calendar year or the fiscal year. And the fiscal year has to do with money situations, and it will depend on the company that you're at, or the calendar year from January to December, just as usual. So just think about those things. We'll talk about some corporate lingo that goes along with that in the next slide. And then, of course, academic program. Instead of calling it an academic program, there are things that you call it: a learning solution, a learning experience. These are sort of new ways to call it. You could, or even training program, right? Depending on what part of the industry you're in, and what role you're in. And then, of course, curriculum at the end. Curriculum is going to run the gamut. It's not sometimes, especially ed tech, they may call it curriculum. You may even see roles out there that are curriculum developers or curriculum specialists or things of that nature. It definitely exists in the corporate world, but not as much. You're going to be finding things where you're developing, where curriculum is more training material, or again, learning experience, instruction, these other kind of words, that is instructional material and things of that nature. So when you speak of curriculum itself, you can use some of that lingo to sort of describe that there. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to ask if there are any questions about this lingo. I noticed the question, does code switching occur on resume and in the interview? Yes, I would absolutely say yes. In fact, and when we get to the student slide, we'll talk about that a little bit. Code switching should absolutely occur on your resume, especially if you're tweaking your resume for a particular company. Definitely make sure that, go through the job description and say, oh, it uses these words, and I remember that this correlates to what I did here, and let that be the code switching happening there. But yeah, and then of course in the interview is where this is going to happen, and we'll talk about that when we get to the STARR method aspect of this of our little presentation. Any other questions?
We got a few more here, Mark, if this is a good spot. Mark had a question about thoughts or advice on how to quantify the impact in the classroom. Standardized tests are things you really can't talk about. How do you make that into corporate talk?
I would say percentages is the best way to do it. You improved certain, you improved your students' capabilities by a certain amount of percent, or graduation percentage. You can talk about it as completion rates. Completion rates are a big deal. Rates really the best way to, in my opinion, and you all, please, if anybody has any other suggestions, by all means put it in the chat. I would turn a lot of your numbers into percentages, because they like to see, oh, it was a 50% increase, or it was a 20% increase, or like I taught a bunch of special needs students for 5 years literacy, and I would keep track of their grade levels, and their grade levels increased by up 2 to 10 levels. Like, it was huge, their increase. And so I turned those into percentages. Like, I had literally 94% of my students increased by at least one grade level, and 89% of them increased by 2 or more. So something like that percentage increase speaks volumes to corporate world.
Is there a sweet spot? Like, should we do the year or just a couple months, or what would you think is kind of the sweet spot for getting the biggest bang for your buck?
I would say, based on, like, look at the numbers. If you have, if over a semester you saw a significant increase, say it that way. Over the course, I would say over the course of 2 quarters, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Over the course of this amount of time, if the percentage increase is higher, use the higher number, or over a year, whatever works for the numbers. Work those out is what I would say.
Nice. I think we had a couple more questions. I'm just scrolling down through here. I know Elizabeth had a question, but it disappeared. I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. How would you translate lead teacher and mentor teacher?
Lead teacher and mentor teacher. So this is my understanding. A lead teacher is probably somebody who leads other teachers in a group that teachers already exist as teachers, whereas a mentor teacher is somebody who's mentoring either a very new teacher or possibly a student teacher. So that might be the difference, I think is what you're saying. And I would categorize them as such. When you're talking about like sort of mentoring in the corporate world, if you're a lead, you're almost like a manager. You're leading a team of people, which can include mentoring, but doesn't necessarily mean you're mentoring. It could also include other sort of even just project management type skills. Whereas if you are set up as a mentor, it's a little bit more informal, where you kind of just set up, sessions with the person to talk about, usually someone who's more junior when it comes to mentoring. Does that help answer that question?
Elizabeth, Can you give us a thumb up if you got it? No, yes, maybe. Some of these you got to kind of play around with. I know, Adam, you had a question about structuring your resume. Hang on to that thought, because Dan is going to dive into an activity that I think will really help you kind of figure out how to structure your resume, and it's also going to be helpful for interviews. But I wanted to touch on another question from Stacy. As a computer teacher, we don't have standardized tests. How do I find numbers to share? If you're a specialist teacher, art or music, how do you quantify the work that you've done?
Yeah, that is such a great question. The honest truth is, be creative. If you worked in the creative area, find ways to talk about performance from a participation standpoint, and then turn them into percentages. You can talk about them from like for example, I used to teach film, documentary film, and the amazing thing about that program when I was teaching, I taught it for 3 years, was that I had 100% participation rate. Every student turned in an activity, turned in a project, which was unheard of when I was teaching Italian, because my Italian students, I mean, it was sometimes 50% of the students completing their projects, or 75% of the students. It was just not as good. But suddenly I was teaching film, and every kid was interested, and every student completed their project. I'm not going to say they were all quality projects, but they all completed it. There was a 100% participation rate from every student within each group. So if there were projects that you did, so you talk about it, especially if you're going into instructional design or something with curriculum development. Talk about how you design these project ideas that cause a sort of 85% participation rate, or cause it to improve. Whereas the year before, when you did a project similar, you only had 75% participation rate, but by the next year was 85%. Some of that stuff is super helpful to show that you are what you develop and what you create improves participation percentage, improves engagement, and you can use it like that as engagement. Maybe that, I don't know if that helps. And if there are any other suggestions, by all means, please put them in here.
As you're talking, Dan, it comes to mind when all of this collaboration that teachers do, you definitely want to throw in the collaborating with key stakeholders is another one I'd throw out there to put in there, because whether you're gen ed
100%.
or a specialist teacher or whatever it was, teachers are constantly bringing groups together and finding solutions. So things to also consider. I know we had a question about rewording handout. Dan, I think you might have one later. It might make a little more sense once Dan dives into his presentation a little bit more, but also suggested ChatGPT is a good way if you're stuck on rewording things to ask ChatGPT.
100%. Yeah, we'll talk about that actually. So the next slide, actually, let's move on, and then we'll get to other questions. I do want to respond to what Dawn said about engagement is a much better word to use instead of participation. 100%. Use engagement instead of participation, because employees kind of have to participate even if they don't like it, but getting them engaged in that participation, that's a big deal. So engagement is definitely a better word to use. Let's move on, and then we'll get to the sort of, I have developed a sort of template for the STARR method, and we'll talk about how that's going to work for the activities that we're moving on. So for this slide, I want to talk about some corporate lingo that doesn't necessarily have translation. Oh, sorry, we're going to talk about students first. I told you I was going to talk about students. We're going to talk about students, and then we'll talk about corporate lingo. So based on the context is the most important part to think about here when you're sort of either replacing the word students with something else, or talking about them when you're in an interview situation. And there's so many words that you could use here: participants, employees, clients, constituents, advisees, trainees. It depends on the situation or the job that you're applying for, and it really truly does. Participants oftentimes are going to be in, like, if you're developing conference situation, developing conference programs or conference whatever. You want these attendees to come in, and the participants of these things will work in a certain way. Employees, most of what happens in LED has to do with training employees of the company, right? So that's going to be your student as the employees, and that's how you're going to talk about them as employees. If you're working in a company that's like a SaaS company, a software as a service, or even an ed tech company, you're going to have companies that are purchasing your products or your maybe even training courses, and those are your clients, and you need to speak to them about how your the clients are the ones who purchase this program or this product that you're developing for, or that you're speaking to, and so, or that you're managing. So you can speak about that way. And then constituents advising, you can find the context where this works, but here's just a few. And if there's anybody who has any other terminology that you've experienced in the corporate world that relate to other ways of talking about students, by all means, please add them to this list. Learners, yes, I can't believe I didn't even put learners on there, but learners, you're going to find that more in the corporate, in maybe the ed tech space, or some educational companies. Learners is used more often. If you're in a training, corporate situation with employees, and you're actually developing for employees, less about learners and more about employees. So that's the word students. Super important word. And I don't want to say there's controversy over it, because some people say don't ever say students at all. I disagree with that. You can, again, use your own personal abilities to code switch and determine based on the context of the situation and the company that you're interacting with.
Could also check the job description, right, Dan? Whatever they say in the job description, put it in your resume or cover letter.
Absolutely.
Because that's going to get the ATS to pick it up.
I love it. Associates in here, someone said that. Yeah, definitely. There's so many words for students that we can use. Cohorts, yes. Okay, let's move on to corporate lingo. This is really a short list compared to some of the things that I'm sure many of you could come up with who moved into corporate world already. But these are some of the ones that tripped me up initially, and so I'm putting them here to talk about. The first one is NPS. NPS is Net Promoter Score, and essentially what this is a score that shows how much people enjoyed maybe the course that you delivered or the product that you delivered. It's it's essentially like usually a 1 to 10 scale or 1 to 5 scale, and the score is based on the percentage of it's a percentage of people who don't like the course, and that it depends on the company, but that might be like they scored you a 1 to 3. So it could be they really hate you, or they're just in the middle or neutral on a 1 to 5 scale. And then the people who liked you are only the 4s and 5s, or only the 8, 9s, and 10s, or something like that. And so it's the percentage of people who didn't care for you so much versus the people who did. It's this whole complicated number. I'm not even going to get into the math of it. But a Net Promoter Score, I do have to say this as a linguist. Do not call it an NPS score. That's redundant. That's like saying ATM machine when it's automated teller machine, when the word is in the acronym. So please call it an NPS. Don't call it an NPS score. That's just the linguist in me speaking out. So NPS is used as a noun. It's our NPS was, or the NPS was calculated as such, something of that nature. Then there's quarter. A quarter is not like in higher education or in grade school. A quarter is usually related to a fiscal year or the seasons of the year. It's just that those first 3 months, and oftentimes, really in the corporate world, everything's divided up by quarters. You oftentimes have quarterly reports, quarterly performance reviews, and things of that nature that happen in quarters. And so another thing that when talking about quarter is they'll say Q1 or Q2 or Q3 or Q4, and those represent quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4 of a year. So those were important lingo for me that I hadn't thought about, but it was something that I had to adjust to. Especially when you're constantly talking about semesters and school years, or marking periods. I worked in New York, and that was what we called, there were 3 marking periods per semester, and those kinds of things. It's just a division of how year works. Yeah, fiscal quarters, fiscal week. And this is where I was talking about before with academic year versus fiscal year or calendar year. Some companies are definitely going to talk about things in terms of fiscal quarter, fiscal year, fiscal week, fiscal stuff like that is important to know. Leadership, something to talk about in leadership is kind of important. There's, in grade schools, if you will, there's the principal and then sometimes an assistant principal, and things. There's this hierarchy that's very different from the corporate world. In the corporate world, there is senior leadership, and then there's C-suite level. So you have your senior vice presidents, and they're literally like a step below the C-suite, which is the CEO, the CFO, the COO, those kinds of things. And if you don't know what those are, look them up. They're just basically the big wigs of the company, and then that senior VP level is usually that senior leadership level are also pretty high on the totem pole. And then leadership below that is going to be managers and things of that nature. Something I also want to talk about is being on that lower end of the scale, and that's the individual contributor, or IC, sometimes they'll call it. That individual contributor in the corporate world is the person who's basically just they don't lead or manage any kind of teams. They're just the person doing a certain job and contributing their sort of individual aspects of what they do for their job to the company whole. So there's a different hierarchy, and some of that knowledge is super important to know, especially if you get into an interview situation and they're saying, so tell me about your experience as an individual contributor or something like that, and you're like, what? Now you know it's sort of that kind of situation. Let's talk about compensation packages and equity. I've been a finalist at several companies, and when you get to a certain point, they talk about the compensation package. And in education, oftentimes we talk about salary. And you're on a salary scale, because there's, especially if you're working for like your local government or school districts, you get paid the same as anybody else who has the same sort of years in the system. That is not the case in the corporate world. That you receive compensation packages, which includes health care, time off, PTO, paid time off. That's what that means. So I didn't even know what PTO meant when I first came into the corporate. I was like, what is this PTO thing? Oh, paid time off. Okay, I get it. It's those kinds of things that you learn about as you're sort of interviewing, and it's nice to know beforehand so that you can actually speak to it specifically. But most importantly is equity. Equity are those stock offers for companies. I remember when I was recruited by Amazon, they asked me what my minimums and maximums were for my compensation package requirements, and I was like, the salary is this, and then they came back and they said, no, that I want to know what the baseline salary is, but I also want to know what with the compensation package, what does that include? That includes equity, and that includes health, like all this other stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have to calculate equity too. I have to tell you my expectations for how much stock I want from you. And it was just a really interesting experience. And through that experience, I discovered that like Amazon employees get somewhere upwards of like $5,000 to $25,000 worth of Amazon stock, and that's the equity. So there's these aspects to a company where you can really increase your compensation through the equity packages, and so that's an important thing to know about. And then COGS. COGS means cost of goods sold. So COGS is related to how much does it cost for you to prepare, build, and then sell a product. So that includes like all the costs, really. And if you can reduce the cost of the goods sold, then you make more money off of the sale. And so this is a super important thing in corporate speak. I'm going to move on instead of stopping for questions, because I really want to get to the main crux of what we're talking about today, and start talking about the interview method and the STARR method. Sometimes people talk about the STARR method with just one R, but because we're teachers, I really, really, really wanted to make sure that we added that final R of the reflection piece, because we do it every single day as teachers. Every single class period, we reflect on how it went and change things up. It's a huge, huge, huge benefit as teachers to be able to we know how to reflect on what we've done as teachers. on a regular basis. And so being able to talk about it in that way is super, super influential in an interview situation. So to quickly describe the STARR method, you're basically setting up the situation that you are in. So let's say the question is like, tell me about a time when you had a problem with a manager and you needed to resolve it, right? These are general questions. And this is how you can sort of practice. Look up the most general questions or the most common questions that are asked in an interview and create a STAR method scenario for it. So you describe that situation. Be very succinct in describing the situation. This is not the important part of the STAR method. The task, what were you required to do? So, I was working on a project that I had to design the curriculum map for. And so that you have the situation, and then you have the task. Then you have the action. What action did you take? Well, the manager did not like my initial design, so I had to go back and redo it because of this, and this, right? Then you talk about the result. The result was I actually understood that my manager was giving me this feedback in the best interest of the client, and so I learned in that moment that I have to do what the client wants. I can't do what I want. So I made the changes even if I wasn't super happy with them. But because my manager knew better than me, the results were that the client was super satisfied with everything that I did, and so they were super happy or something. I'm just making up a general sort of situation. So when it comes to teacher speak, we get into that moment where, okay, so the reflection there was I learned that I learned to trust my manager more. Even though I didn't agree with my manager, I learned to trust them more. And it's those kinds of things that they want to hear in an interview. Even though I realized when I delivered this product that the client was unhappy with it because of this and this reason. And so I learned that when I do these things, I cannot forget this aspect of something. It's that, what did I learn from the situation, that comes in that sort of final R, reflection. So I want to make sure that it's showing up. This is the activity here that I want to work out with everyone here. And this is kind of the activity that I did when I first started preparing for interviews. I did a brain dump, and this was for the STARR Interview Method. I told the entire story of situation. I went through and I found a bunch of common asked interview questions, and I thought of several stories that could answer that question. And then I did a brain dump. I told the entire story, how I would tell a friend, and I'm very verbose, so I would tell everything about the story. And then, much like I was an English teacher for a very long time, so I taught a lot about writing. Much like when you're teaching students how to write, you teach them that first draft should never be, or that rough draft should never be the final draft. And that's when you take that sort of that brain dump story, and that's when you start translating the words. And it really works well if you put those words in there that you are used to talking about, and then doing this actual translation where you're taking that story and turning it into a more corporate speak sort of situation. You edit this, you hone it, you revise it, you duplicate it. Oftentimes a story can be used for various answers, because the situation, you didn't just learn one thing from the situation. You might have learned 5 different things from the situation so that it could respond to 5 different questions. But you don't need to talk about all 5 of those things that you learned to answer one question. But you can use that story again and pivot the response or the reflection part, the results and reflection part, to fit the response to the question, if that makes sense. So that's what I mean by duplicate. You may feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I have enough stories to answer all these questions. That's okay. And I have been many times in an interview where they've asked me a question and I tell them a story and I talk about the results, and then they say, oh, well, tell us about a time that you did this. And I'm like, well, actually, it's very similar. It was in the same situation, but this was another thing that happened in that situation that led to this. And then these results happened here. So there's nothing wrong with talking about a similar situation, especially if you feel like you don't have, like, I don't know, sometimes people feel like they don't have enough stories. Don't feel like in an interview situation you can't talk about something that you talked about before, especially if you know how to kind of pivot the response. Because as I said before, the results and the reflection are the most important part of the STARR interview thing. So if those results answer the question then by all means use a similar situation, use the same situation. Okay. All right, so we're at where I can take questions again, but I also want to show. I have a template that I created for myself that has to do with the STARR method, and I can share the link. Abby, do I need to share that? Can I just put it in the chat?
Yeah, you can actually. Why don't you drop it in the event feed, because we have a lot of people that aren't live today.
Oh, sure.
This way, anybody can kind of go back and access it after we close out, so people can go back and reference it. Because I know all this doesn't come at once. You're going to think of different things to add, and it just takes some time. But don't be afraid to brag about yourself. This is the best way that I know how to brag about yourself and inspire yourself. Of wow, cool! Look at all the things I did. And I think as teachers are undersung, they don't get a lot of praise for the things they did. So really brag about yourself. This is a chance to show people how awesome you are. Don't be scared of it. Embrace it.
Okay, I think I'm doing something wrong. Where is my event feed? Event feed.
And I know we're 13 minutes to have some questions, but I want to let you all know, if you didn't get your question answered, Dan has graciously offered to hang out at a table after this session. So if you want to chat more, have a specific question, not to worry, you can join that table and get a little more information, or just be a fly on the wall, whatever you want to do.
Okay, I sent the template. So in the template, and I'll just walk through it really quickly. The project, it has the project, product name, and the problem we're trying to solve. This is all part of sort of the situation. Oftentimes, like if you're developing a STARR method response for an interview, you want to really focus on the problem that you solved, because that's going to help you come up with a really great solution. If you're just talking about, this is what I did, and it's a common job, a common thing to do on the job, it's not going to be super helpful for you. Talk about an actual problem that came up that you helped to solve. That's going to be very, very helpful in building these sort of STARR method situations. And then here I talk about the roles process or approach, your roles process or approach to solving it, which really is the task here. And then any issues or bumps along the way. So when you're talking about that task part of STARR, try to include those things that came up that might have been a problem. And you can, again, pivot whether you talk about those problems or not, but list them all. That way you can reuse this based on the situation or the question that's being asked. And then you have that outcome or solution, which is essentially, this isn't the result, the outcome or solution. It's kind of part of the action that you took to solve the problem. What did you do that fixed the problem, or that pivoted the problem, or that changed the problem?
Hey, Dan, I don't think we have access to your template.
Oh, goodness. Let me see if I can fix the sharing. Oh, there it is. I fixed it. Sorry, it was locked. Did that work? So then, and you can feel free to like copy this and you take it as your own. I'm totally fine, and you can rework all the tabs at the top. I just tried to make this work for me because of my own mind. So rework it however you choose. The impact on learning, that column I is going to be that is where your results are going to lie. And sometimes it's called impact metrics being the numbers that showed your impact. And I talked about this before with teacher stuff. Use those percentages. Try to find percentages here. This is where those impact metrics can come into play. So talk about the impact on the impact that you made by solving this problem. How did that impact the team that you're working on, the company as a whole? And if there are any metrics, please by all means add those in. And so once you've kind of developed this is kind of also the brain dump template, if you will. You put everything in there. Then that final part, the interview story, that's where you write down your succinct, keep it under a minute, response to an interview question. And this is where you can sort of practice, and you can expand upon it. You put 3 different stories in there to talk about the 3 different results based on a certain question that's being asked of you. Sometimes, and this is a recommendation for the template, if you want to add the interview question at the beginning of each of these sort of like lines, so that you know what question you're answering and have that be the story at the end. You can add a tab or a column that just has the questions that you're trying to respond to. So there's different things you can do with this template. This is just and the example in there is very, very basic. So take this how you will, but this is my advice, and this is my help in the best I can. And I wish I had more time to talk about it, but I'm definitely going to be in the table after this. If anybody wants to come in and talk specifics about certain things, I'm happy to shoot the breeze.
Definitely. I think we have about 9 minutes left. So I don't know if anyone had kind of a question as a wrap up, or if they just prefer to talk to Dan in a smaller setting where he can actually see all of your faces. It's really hard to be on this side when we can't see our audience as a teacher. It's different. So would all of you prefer we close early and open up some tables? Can we get a thumbs up or an emoji if you like? Okay, all right. I think people like that idea, Dan. So if you don't know where to find the tables, once you exit this session, resume structure.
Oh, yes, resume structure. I definitely want to talk about that. Okay. So I had actually some great advice for resume. And the interesting thing is that I find that on LinkedIn especially, you're going to be contacted a million times over by resume writers who tell you that they can do it better. Please ignore them. I hate to say it that way, but ignore them. If you find somebody that you trust or somebody that you know that worked with somebody that they really liked, by all means, pursue that. But don't have your resume go through more than 1 or 2 people. After that, it's just they're just trying to make money off you, in my opinion. Opinion according to Dan. Take your resume. When you want your skills at the top. That's the best structure I'm talking about. And those skills, they cannot be general skills. They need to be very specific skills. Don't say things like project management skills or, I don't know, leadership skills. Those that they don't care about that in those top skills. You need to talk about things like, okay, I know Google Classroom. I know Smartboard technology. I know Microsoft Office Suite. Like those are the skills you put at the top. Okay. Your leadership skills, your project management skills, those go in the description. So my biggest recommendation for the actual jobs that you've had is you put a kind of like sentence or phrase at the top that talks about the things that you did at the company, to give a general overview of the tasks that you were involved in as part of your job title and your role. And that's where you can include things like I was a leader, I project managed, I did those kinds of things in that kind of like blurb, and then bullet points. All the bullet points can speak actually to some of the things that you put into your results tab on this template. So you put the result, like I did this, I solved this problem, I created these metrics, I solved this issue for the company. That's where those bullet points come in on a resume. It's gonna be super duper helpful. And when it comes to teachers, for those moments when you're talking about the schools that you worked at or the school districts that you worked at, my recommendation, if you worked for 15 years or 10 years or 5 years as a teacher, if you're going to put each individual school to sort of like make your resume look robust, do that. Otherwise, just put it all as one lump for a certain amount of time, and then speak to specific stories that help that school. Talk if you can, because you've had experience like mentoring or helping other teachers and colleagues. If you ran PDs, anything where you were working with other teachers and not just students, must go in there. Don't just talk about the things you did with students. And like I was the cheerleading coach once for 2 years, but what I put in there in terms of being a cheerleading coach was the fact that I developed the entire program. I had to source the pom poms and uniforms. I had to run all the auditions. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff to that was completely separate from just teaching the kids how to do a cheer. So there's things like that where if you did something, talk about the whole process and what that did for the school. Like, and that's a really great way to sort of structure those bullets so that you're showing what you did to make the school better, not just you taught the students and they got some really great and they called you your favorite teacher or something. You know, like those are great, but they're not going to speak on a resume. Does that help?
Definitely think
there's skills and experience, and then education. I put education at the bottom. In the education world, you oftentimes put education at the top. Put it at the bottom. It's they want to know that you have that education, but it's not the most important.
I think just from what I've heard, even my time supporting boot camp students, it's not so much about where your education was, it's about your skills. And as long as you can talk about your skills, that's really what employers care about. That's why they're asking to tell you about times like that, so that they can figure out, oh, how are you going to react in a situation that's similar? So a lot of interviews, you're going to encounter this. I got a lot of opinions about resume writing, LinkedIn profile tips, but I definitely want you all to be able to have a chance to talk to Dan. So I'll open a table later if you want to talk LinkedIn and job searches, but I think we'll go ahead and stop here, Dan, because it's a good place to stop. Yeah. So
I do want to respond one more question that you had about integrating into experience. Your accomplishments, yes, I would integrate them into experience, or you can integrate them into other things. Like if your education is where you had those accomplishments, you can add them as bullets underneath your education, or as part of the blurb for what your degree was. You know, based on what those accomplishments were, like if you published something or if you know, those kind of things, I would integrate them as much as possible into the experience section.
Bobby raised a good point. If you actually have to have a certification, if it says it in the job description, don't apply unless you have that certification. If it asks for your project management certification, you need to have it. So there are roles that are necessary, that credentials are necessary, but others, if it doesn't specifically say it, then you can definitely speak to your skills. And women are historically underrepresented. We're ones that want to check every single box, and we don't have to. It's okay if you see most of the bullets, but not all. Go ahead and give it a try anyway. The answer is always no until you try. So fight your imposter syndrome. But we thank Dan so much. He is so fantastic, has so many insights. We hope to be able to continue the conversation via tables. And I'm sure if you haven't already, Dan will probably throw his LinkedIn information in there. So happy to connect. This is a hobby and a passion of his. He loves to help mentor people, just kind of help people navigate a new space. So feel free to reach out, find him at a table. And we thank you all so much for attending. And we hope to see you a little bit later.
Thanks, everyone.